Looks like the panel has assembled. Well, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce to you perhaps one of the finest panels of experts that we've been able to assemble to start our general discussions this morning. Many of you in the audience are well acquainted with the folks, the men and women seated before you, and have worked with them for a number of years. But for those of you who have not had that opportunity, let me just take a couple of minutes in my introductory remarks to tell you a little bit about them. Seated kind of contrary to what I had originally designed, we're out of order because they're all out of order, which is an indication of how they do their business. It's somewhat disorganized, but still very effective. Let me start with Gillian Buckley. Gillian, raise your hand if you would. She was the study director and the editor of a landmark review of the problem of falsified and substandard medicines on behalf of the Institute of Medicine. Let me point out that for those of you who think there's not a lot of information about this topic or who perhaps are looking for some really groundbreaking information, I'd suggest that you take a look at the book that was edited and put together as the study director by Gillian. It's superb, Countering the Problem of Falsified and Substandard Drugs. Gillian is a PhD in human nutrition and has a master's degree in international health, both from Johns Hopkins University. She served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal from 2000 to 2002. And then on the far left is Samantha Gamble. Samantha is the World Customs Organization Communications Manager for the Intellectual Property Rights and Health and Safety Program for the WCO's Enforcement Directorate. By capturing the attention of the customs officers worldwide and by ensuring that their vigilance with regard to counterfeit products includes counterfeit pharmaceuticals is really the heart of that particular program. She's been participating with the WCO in the IPR arena, both operationally and promoting information, disseminating information on this particular problem for the past 2 years. Seated to my immediate left is Agent Phil Walsky. Phil is the acting director of the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations. Phil served as a field agent, an assistant agent in charge, and the SAC, special agent in charge at both headquarters and in the field. His government service included work with as a U.S. Secret Service agent and Marshal Service as well. He has taught at various universities in New Jersey and New York City and is an exceptional member of our panel. And we look forward to some really hard questions for Phil. I like to get the teachers on the spot. And then on my far left, a place that Jim does not often occupy, he's usually on the far right, is Jim Dahl. Jim is an investigative and security professional with a substantial history of success. Jim, too, has 30 years of government service, having served as the assistant director of the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations. He's able to provide some fairly unique insights because in addition to the government service, he has served as the security director, product security director for OCI, major Japanese manufacturing company. And as for myself, I was introduced earlier. I'm currently the president and CEO of the Pharmaceutical Security Institute. And I'd like to start this discussion by giving you a little bit of a recap of some of the information that we've been able to develop with the full support of the 28 member companies. In 2013, we had a special enhanced collection effort that was ongoing, and I wanted to share with you some of the key findings of the Pharmaceutical Securities Institute's annual report. Some of these findings are available online, and they're useful in trying to understand the scope of the problem and the the global dimension, because basically what happens abroad does impact on the U.S. And the panel's question before us today is whether or not the U.S. patients, U.S. doctors are being targeted by transnational organized crime groups as places that are markets that are particularly interested and attractive to them because of the rewards for those illegal activities. In addition to the expanded data collection, we received over 11,200 reports of pharmaceutical crime. That would include not only counterfeit reported incidents, but also incidents of illegally diverted medicines. Medicines that were approved for sale and distribution in one country, but because they're smuggled, because there are false declarations accompanying those medicines, they wind up within the United States and other places where they are not approved for distribution. And lastly, we're interested in major thefts of genuine medicines that are then moved also in the global commerce and wind up being poorly handled and subject to environmental degradation. In 2000, so basically our reporting increased by over 43% from 2012 to 2013. From those things, we look at what we call unique incidents, and those are cases where it is a medicine that we had seen appear in a particular country for the very first time. And what we saw was that there were 2,193 new incidents in 2013. And most importantly, that was the highest annual total of new incidents that we had ever documented, and it was the first substantial increase. The good news to that is that drug regulators, law enforcement, have become much more aggressive and effective in identifying these types of incidents. So it's kind of a yin and yang was mentioned earlier, but it is a good news, bad news type scenario. We saw illegal diversion increase last year. The number of incidents of illegal diversion rose 24% over 2012. And then and once again, I mentioned that this is because we think there's increased attention and direction and focus on these types of investigations. So the first trend identified in 2013 was the documentation of the highest ever total number of incidents with the highest ever total number of diversion cases identified. Concerning the effectiveness and some of the work that's done, we'll hear a little bit more about that. But we also looked at 142 open source reports, and we found that in total affected 38 different countries with 351 tons of illegal medicines, unsafe medicines that were seized. The estimated value or reported value by the police agencies was $757 million. We then looked at 1,156 particular seizure activities, and we found that of those, 526 were of commercial size. By that I mean that's the size that is over 1,000 dosage units. And what we saw was that there was, in terms of a percentage of commercial seizures, it totaled 46% of that 1,156 number versus 40% last year. So the trend evident is that seizures, that the counterfeiters are returning to their selling or shipping their products internationally in somewhat larger shipments than they had in the past. In terms of the third trend evident was we saw an increase in arrest globally. There was an 18% increase over 2012. And we saw in a very significant manner an increase in the number of individuals arrested for illegal manufacturing operations. That's the ultimate goal for a lot of these types of investigations and of keen interest. If we can move away from the street level dealers and focus investigative efforts internationally on the major players who are manufacturing, we'll have a much better impact. There were two other important metrics that were used and assessed last year. And as I mentioned, the illegal manufacturing operations, globally, there were 63 manufacturing operations that law enforcement was able to dismantle and disrupt last year. That increased from 37 in 2012. Another major concern for drug regulators is how often as Tim had mentioned, do these types of medicines get into the legitimate supply chain? The Avastin case was given as one example. Globally, there were 426 incidents where we found counterfeit medicines and diverted medicines had actually entered the legitimate supply chain, reached licensed wholesalers and distributors in 49 different countries. There was another, I mentioned earlier that there was a visible increase in enforcement efforts, and we'll have Samantha will talk a little bit about that in terms of some of the work of the World Customs Organization. But we see that there's a much better, a much sharper focus on this particular problem. We also see complementary actions being undertaken by organizations, associations such as PhRMA, the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers, and associations in Geneva, Switzerland, which launched this past year a Fight the Fakes campaign joined by a dozen NGOs. So the private sector has increased and ramped up their game in this regard as well, and also a very noteworthy effort. We'll talk a little bit in the panel about some legislative initiatives. We are familiar with what happened and what was passed here in the U.S., and we can talk about the diverse range of laws that are being pursued and legislative changes globally. But it has attracted attention of lawmakers around the world, which is in fact a very important and interesting development. So that's just kind of a thumbnail summary of some of the things that we saw happening last year. And what I'd like to do, if I may start with you, Gillian, and you'll get the first question, if I could. Everybody's mic'd up, right?
Yeah.
And I'm gonna go slide over to my chair and take my chair as well. But if you would, this report was issued in February of 2013. It contained a number of recommendations, and what I'd ask is if you would address some of the primary recommendations and give our audience some insights as to the kinds of things that IOM viewed as most important.
Sure. Happy to. Should I start?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, is that the question you want me to start with?
Yes.
Okay.
If you want to. If you'd like to give some
the recommendations.
Recommendations.
Most important. Okay. So the committee talked a lot about investing in medicines regulation in developing countries. And one of the committee members was the former head of the Tanzanian Drug Regulatory Authority. And many of the others have worked with drug regulatory authorities in low and middle income countries. And they just saw that there are a lot of needs. There's need for training, need for equipment, need for things like reference standards. And the training of regulators is not necessarily something that donor agencies take much interest in. And they also felt that just sometimes the scope of the needs of the agencies was so much that it can be a bit overwhelming and lead to inaction. So they asked that regulatory agencies in low and middle income countries take the first step of developing a strategic plan, 5 years for five-year plan for agency development, which is something they can take to their ministers and use to advocate for themselves. And it's also something that the agencies can show to donors and ask the donors to contribute to kind of contribute in a more orderly way to the agency's goals for development. And part of the reason why they felt that this is so important, why the committee felt this is so important, is because the regulatory authority has the ultimate responsibility for enforcing distribution standards, enforcing the laws, and for enforcing manufacturing standards. And drug manufacture in low and middle income countries is complicated, and the situation is not so good right now. But and so they made a separate recommendation about to development finance organizations. This is organizations like OPEC and the IFC to invest in the manufacture of medicines in low and middle income countries. So these companies need to buy, it's expensive to meet international manufacturing standards. You need certain equipment, you need, there's staff costs, there's process costs, and the committee felt that sometimes those expenses are holding back these companies from producing the best quality product. That for example, these companies need to buy equipment on foreign markets using hard currency, and that is something that their national banks might not necessarily be willing or able to give them. And that was a role for development finance to be able to make hard currency loans. In rich countries, if a small or medium-sized business needs to raise capital, they can mortgage their assets, but the mortgage laws in most low and middle income countries disallow that. And then also, often these companies, their main client might be the government, and they're sometimes obliged to absorb their customers' debts, which reduces their working capital for long stretches at a time. So in short, one of the committee's main conclusions was that the poor in low and middle income countries often pay more for lower quality medicine, and that these are two ways that donors and governments of those countries can help improve that situation by building up the national regulatory authorities and by investing in the honest generics manufacturers. By investing in generics manufacturers, by making these hard currency loans available.
And Gillian, has there been any progress in some of the recommendations, or have you had the opportunity to engage in discussions with perhaps some of the folks at whom these recommendations had been directed?
Yes. Actually, we had another recommendation. Well, so one of the recommendations that the committee made was supporting the WHO in this post-market surveillance project that Michael Dietz and his team in Geneva have headed up. They said that just investing in the market surveillance in low and middle income countries, and they do a lot of this at WHO. I know his team has done trainings all over Asia, Africa, and a lot of the former Soviet Union. They have this system where the market surveillance staff are trained. If they find a suspect product, they contact Geneva. People at WHO can help with the quality testing. They help with everything. So not only are they kind of building up skill in pharmacovigilance, but sometimes there are seemingly disparate incidents. They find, a dangerous product in Angola and the same product in somewhere like Cambodia. Those two regulatory authorities would never have any way, under normal circumstances, of communicating with each other or knowing that they're both the victim of the same criminal ring, but through this interaction with Geneva, they're more able to identify these things. The committee also made a recommendation about track and trace in the U.S. drug supply chain. So they were very happy to see the president sign the Drug Quality and Security Act last November. And there was another one I wanted to mention. It'll come to me, sorry.
Okay,
Sorry.
I'll give you some time to think about that one. Yeah, the question on the floor had been, or the earlier speakers had addressed the concern about the lack of quality data. And in fact, one of the initiatives that Gillian had mentioned being undertaken by the WHO is to do just that, to do these trainings and to encourage reporting to the WHO. Having talked to various government officials around the world, the basic question they have is that, hey, there's time and energy that comes to us or that is required of us in order to make these reports. And what do we get out of it? I mean, what's the payback? And the answer, as illustrated and discussed by Gillian, is that they're able to link disparate events, and they can act much more quickly to identify counterfeit products that are in the marketplace and effectively increase patient safety. So there is a value that is now seen through this reporting system that Mick Dietz is working on at WHO. So it's a really it's been well progressed and moving nicely.
I did remember one other thing that so one of the recommendations the committee made was about regulators in low and middle income countries using the Common Technical Document for market authorization. And if you take a country like French Guiana has maybe less than 300,000 people in the whole country, and if they are requiring a separate application for market authorization, that puts a big burden on industry, especially on generics companies. It might take 6-person months of staff time a year, 12-person months of staff time to fill out that application to get market authorization for a market that it would never pay back that kind of investment on the company's part. So we talked a lot about using Common Technical Document. And we did have a meeting in Africa with the heads of regulatory agencies conducted in conjunction with one of the WHO trainings on pharmacovigilance. And we talked a lot about the Common Technical Document, and different African regulatory agencies are using it, some are not, and the heads of agencies talked about perceived barriers to using it and the perceived gains, and it was a really productive discussion. It was great to hear that there's a lot of momentum to switching towards that.
Great, thanks. IOM was not the only agency that was active in issuing a report. A couple of months ago, the World Customs Organization released their report on the illicit trade. In part, some of that document discussed the problem with counterfeit medicines. Samantha, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about WCO and the things that they're doing, and some of the activities, operations that have been successful.
Sure.
Thank you.
Is this working? Yeah. So I see some of you have already seen this presentation the other day, so I apologize for the repetition. But so for those of you who don't know the WCO, we're the only international organization that deals with customs enforcement and procedures. We are member-based. We have 179 members, national customs administrations. And our main objective is to harmonize customs procedures, facilitate global trade, and in general just try to secure and protect the supply chain. I'm part of the IPR team, so I'll just get into a little bit what we do for our health and safety program. We conduct a lot of capacity building activities. The aim of these activities is, well, on the one hand, to raise awareness as much as possible to the dangers of counterfeit products, whether it be medicines or all categories of products. And we really want to try to make counterfeiting and IPR violations a priority within the customs administrations, because, of course, for a lot of these administrations, it's not at the top of their list. They have other more important, or think are more important threats to deal with. So our capacity building activities consist in operations, seminars, and an online tool called IPM. Operations are our signature capacity building activity. They consist in regrouping multiple countries, and they will simultaneously enhance their enforcement on counterfeit goods. I'll get into one of these operations a little bit after. We also conduct seminars, regional or national seminars. These are mostly destined for field customs officers. During these seminars, we will examine the legal framework of a country or several countries if it's a regional one. And we will train the customs officers in targeting and risk analysis, cargo targeting mostly. And we also do all of this with the help of rights holders who also come and train the customs on how to distinguish fake products of their brands. We have developed an online tool called IPM, which is a database of product information. It's just key information to help the customs officers distinguish between a fake and a genuine product. So information such as routing or packaging or contacts by region. So that's just our, globally, our capacity building activities. Now, Tom, you mentioned the illicit trade report. We published it a couple of months ago. The data is for 2013. Since 2012, this report is now available to the public. You can access it on our website if you manage to find it. Could good luck with that. If not, please send me an email or give me your card if you're interested, and I can send you the link. It'll save you a lot of time. And so, of course, our illicit trade report covers all of our enforcement activities, so it's not specifically dedicated to counterfeiting, but it does have an IPR segment in it. Again, it's not just focused on medicines, but the elements and the data that we do have on medicines are mostly from one of our bigger operations called Operation Biella, which took place in April 2013. So customs officers from 23 African countries were trained and then targeted containers, opened them, seized any illicit goods. The result of this operation was 1.1 billion items of illicit or counterfeit goods, half of which were medicines. So that's 560 million doses of illicit medicines. Now you may think that the number one category of these products would be erectile dysfunction medicine, but not at all. The largest amounts were antibiotics, dietary supplements, and anti-malaria medicine. So, of course, the problem is touching all kinds of medicines. I wish I could talk about, we just conducted another Operation Biella. The press conference won't take place until Monday 22nd, so if you're interested in getting the results of that, you can also have a look on our website. We'll publish a press release about that.
Thank you, Samantha. In terms of your training, is it customary to have the drug regulator participate in the training as well, or prosecutors?
Yes, we try to work as much as possible with the national regulators. If they're not present during the training, we're in any case in contact with them throughout the operation. If we have any suspicions with certain medicines, or of course we try to work with them as much as possible.
Great, thanks. Phil, I'd like to bounce a few questions your way. You look awful comfortable down there.
No, I'm just sedated.
Okay. All right.
Lights.
It's the lights, yeah.
You know, we know that the transnational groups, have begun to focus their efforts on getting into the U.S., beating some of the systems. We see how effective they are at beating systems in the developing nations, which have a less of a structured regulatory function, perhaps are plagued with corruption at various levels. And, we're fortunate that those are not the situations here. We have effective enforcement. We have effective regulatory oversight. The question I have for you today is really how does OCI respond or has responded to that particular challenge in some of these fraudulent drug schemes?
Well, first of all, FDA as a whole recognizes that the safety of regulated products is a global effort, and one of the strategic priorities for FDA is globalization, and so goes OCI as FDA goes. Now, OCI has been involved in the international arena very heavily with Interpol, with PIFIC, the Permanent Forum on International Pharmaceutical Crime, groups like that, for quite some time. And as we see, and one of the slides from one of the presenters had, the matrix of some of the Avastin case and the dynamic on that is getting more complex. It's getting more complicated. There's more actors involved. There's more actors in many different parts of the world, some which you would not expect them to be in. And it's kind of like a lot of other webs. Once the web sort of is out there, you go down the web and you find that there's other things that are interconnected, and you have to follow and kind of track things down. So one of the things that we in OCI has been doing is we had made a determination not that long ago that we have to get our feet out there. We have to get our feet out in the international community. So we're increasing our global presence. So one of the things that we did, I'm happy to say, in June June of this year, we put our first agent assigned overseas in the Netherlands at Europol in The Hague. We're looking at other countries. We're possibly looking at Singapore, and then a little bit down the road, hopefully not far down the road, we're looking at somewhere in South America, Latin America, in that region. And that agent not only there would not only be there, it's not just to coordinate cases or to look at cases, but it's also to participate in this outreach and to get the criminal investigative arm of the FDA, to get our foot out in different parts of the world. With that, we're also looking at just our outreach, our regular just international outreach. As I mentioned Interpol and I mentioned PIFIC, we have been sending agents out on details to a variety of countries. We had an agent out in Singapore, agent out in India for about a month, a little bit more than a month at each time. Chile. We're really trying to expand the educational and training, frankly, of not only the criminal investigative portions of those other countries, but also the regulatory functions. And we kind of go through not only what we're about, but it's a way of helping them see what we see, or what they could be looking for, and what they should be looking for. And those efforts have been very successful, and it's an investment in time and resources, but it's well worth it, and to get out and to do this. And it's been very positively well received. It's kind of one of those things. We go out to one country, went out to Chile. We go out, we give a training and a presentation out to the regulatory and law enforcement counterparts. And then all of a sudden, the calls and the emails come in from other countries, and they want this same type of thing. And we're happy to provide it. It's a lot of these other countries are recognizing that they have an issue. And even if their regulatory and certainly the criminal enforcement isn't there, if the structure's not there, at least you're getting that out. You're getting out what's going on and what to say. Interestingly, one of the things that we've done, and it seemed like a very small thing at the time, OCI has a web page. It's part of the FDA.gov web page, and you go into criminal investigations. And we have press releases there, and we have information about OCI. But we put in a most wanted, like a wanted list. And the real reason for doing that originally was because we have a lot of fugitives out there. They come and go, and it was really a practical thing. But the interesting thing about that is that the press and other groups, interested parties, stakeholders, had picked up on that. And a lot of times when we get requests for interviews or they want information about OCI, it's about that. And it's about not necessarily specifically some of the folks whose mugshots are presented on there, but just about what's going on. What's this about? Why aren't these people just in your backyard? Really? I mean, you have people who are wanted, in other parts of the world. People, yeah. And it's been pretty interesting to see that response, a response that we had not expected. But we plug away at it, and we have to work with other agencies, and as I said, it gets more complicated as you look in the webs of these it's not just medicines, it's all regulated products, frankly, for us.
I won't ask you about a specific case, obviously, but in general, much of the effective working relationships are dependent on cooperation. And we read a lot and we see a lot about Canadian internet operators. And my question is, Health Canada does not have investigative authority, kind of your counterpart, to my knowledge. They have inspection authority. And that would mean that most likely you're coordinating with the RCMP in these types of cases. And could you comment on the cooperation, degree of cooperation, how that's going?
With our CMP in particular? We have very good relations with them. Canada has their own priorities. They have Professor Amir. You're going to say, I know you have a comment. They have their own issues. You know, we have ours. We're a regulatory agency for the American public. The RCMP is very helpful with us within the parameters of what they can do, and what they're allowed to do. What we do is we also, we obviously have a very good relationship. We have actually somebody assigned to Interpol, and we have very good relationships with all the other countries. But there is common ground, and not just with Canada, but with other countries. You know, the OCI we're a law enforcement agency, but we are basically the detectives, or the law enforcement are for the FDA, which is a public health agency. So our priority, it is criminal investigations, but it's public health. We're the police for a public health agency, and so we always try to spin that. That's the message, and we try to make. We're not just about trying to make a criminal case. We're here because there's a public health issue. Happens to be criminality involved. There may be criminality involved, but that's what we're here for, a public health message.
Great, thanks, Phil. Let's turn our attention and focus and give Jim an opportunity to make some comments and answer some questions. You've been in a unique position, having seen this problem from both the public sector side, private sector side, and and we often hear that unfortunately the police, whether they're in Cambodia, Canada, or wherever, don't have the proper tools to address this problem. Perhaps, Jim, if you'd give us a little bit of an update on, there's the Metacrimes Convention. UNODC is looking at some things that might lead to some changes, some initiatives. Could you tell the audience a little bit about the Metacrimes Convention, where that is, and what that's all about?
Yes, Metacrime, it was written by the Council of Europe in 2010, and it was made to address criminal issues involving medical products, not just medicines, but medical devices, APIs, and even excipients. And it seeks to provide definitions, set forth a standard set of criminal activity, and expand the possibilities for cooperation and awareness between the member nations. So, we think that this will be is of great need. It's a Council of Europe issue right now, but it allows for other countries to sign on, and we hope that this will go a long way in expanding the ability of agencies like Phil heads to work with each other and identify and suppress this criminal activity.
Great, thanks, Jim. We're a little more than halfway through this panel discussion, and before I start another round of questions, I'd like to open it up to the floor to provide some ample time for discussion, dialogue, and so on. So if we've got a microphone available, we'll pass it around to the audience members for comment or observations.
Professor Amir Atarin from the University of Ottawa in Canada. Can I add a little bit to this Health Canada RCMP issue?
Sure.
What I'm about to say may sound extreme. I apologize if so, particularly because the Canadian Embassy is next door. But all of you have to, as a Canadian, as a professor of law and medicine in Canada, I know this field well, and you have to get your heads around the following reality. There has been a political choice made in Canada to tolerate disorganized crime. This is not a question of enforcement being a bit weak or disorganized. There has actually been deliberate political choice to let internet pharmacies operate illegally. And the clearest evidence I can give you is that in 2005, Parliament voted. This was a vote in Parliament. This is not something accidental. And the vote basically said the health, pardon me, the health minister should not enforce the law on internet pharmacies. That is an explicit decision. And since then, you know what's happened, a whole lot of nothing. Earlier this year, a couple months ago, the #2 cop in the RCMP Deputy Commissioner Mike Cabana, really good guy, in front of Canada's Senate said, we've done dozens of investigations and charged nobody. That's because they're being politically blocked. So if you want to crack this problem, stop playing nice. You just have to. You have to be, you know, I think what you need to now talk about is trade sanctions. And it disappoints me to some extent you don't have USTR people here. I think that's what it's going to take. So that's one thing. Other thing, very quickly, you mentioned the UNODC effort to write a model law for medicine crime. I'm the lead author on that. To be completely frank, the project has not proceeded with all the openness I would have liked. It has been largely confined to European voices. I think there is a very urgent need for people in this room to try and participate in it so that we have the best product at the end of the day. And I say that as the lead consultant and as the lead author. I'm very supportive of what UNODC is trying to do, otherwise I wouldn't be there helping them. But the team, the bench, is not as strong as it should be right now.
Great.
I'll comment on that. I've always got a comment. But I'll look back to my days in OCI and maybe comment a little more indiscreetly than Phil will be allowed to because I'm retired. But years ago I was on the House Judiciary Committee as an investigator, and DEA indicted a guy named Pablo Escobar for bringing cocaine to the United States, and Pablo said, I've never even been to the United States. How can those guys indict me? Well, I think that's how to play with the Canadians now. We've seen some indictments, Strempler. I hope we see a lot more. And clearly they're violating the laws of the United States, and they need to be indicted in the United States, and they need to be brought here in handcuffs and locked up for a long time. And I'm hoping that we're going to see more and more and more of that. And I think we're just starting, but it's going to happen. And I agree. That's the only way it's really going to put an end to it. We've heard a lot about the Avastin case from 2012, and yes, Avastin was one drug. It was a counterfeit drug. There were 15 or 20 drugs involved in that criminal enterprise. Most of them were diverted from cheap markets like Turkey into the United States. All illegal, all misbranded drugs, all driven by a criminal enterprise in Winnipeg. So we've not heard the end of the Avastin and those cases yet, and hopefully Phil's got a lot of people working on that right now.
Well, I think it would, to build a case to move towards trade sanctions, and I'm not an expert at this at all, but it would seem to me that you've got to make the basic argument that these are criminal enterprises operating, freely and openly, and that in order to provide evidence, some oomph, if you would, for USTR and so on to become more engaged, I think you really have to have that put together. Some of the security directors in the room today were on to, in a very early fashion, some of these same subjects that we're talking about that we now see being prosecuted. So they've done a good job at building the basis and making good referrals to the OCI, to US HSI, as well as to the FBI. But it is a challenge because much of the work that is ongoing is done based on cooperation between law enforcement to law enforcement on an international arena. And placing people abroad is certainly a good step in building that kind of relationship that's going to be enduring and it's going to be an effective relationship, not one where it's just very superficial. So.
And we're looking to place somebody possibly in Canada too, and I know somebody might say, well, they're right over the border, they're right there, but because their work is there,
yeah,
and the issues are there,
Yeah, there were
Something to look at.
similarities. As chief of the FBI's white-collar crime section some years ago, we saw telemarketers who were victimizing senior citizens in the U.S. And what happened is through a series of investigations, there were over 150 subjects arrested and convicted here in the U.S. Well, they promptly moved to Canada. And they began operating with impunity in 3 major Canadian cities. But we were able to convince the Department of Justice, which supported the Bureau's effort at placing FBI agents in those 3 cities to work in a task force to address this specific problem. And I would like to see something like that evolve from, in a partnership with OCI, the Bureau, or HSI, in a similar fashion with the Canadian authorities being a full on-board partner. I think they could have a dramatic impact and be more effective in securing the drug supply. Yes, sir, we had a question here for the panel.
I am Dick Weiss. I'm the retired Chief Operating Officer of the National Grange. I have a question for either Phil or Jim. Are the major drug cartels involved in this trade of fake pharmaceuticals, or is it a different group of criminals?
I don't think the major narcotics delivery, cocaine, heroin delivery cartels are directly involved. I do know of a case, the defendant's names escape me right now, but it was the largest counterfeit case in the United States, maybe 10, 12 years ago. It was Pfizer's Lipitor, and the 2 people were doing time in federal prison for cocaine smuggling. And they got together and they said, we already have a network, let's use it to deliver, at first diverted Lipitor from Brazil into the United States, and then they couldn't keep up with supply, so they started counterfeiting Lipitor in Latin America and brought that into the United States. So they certainly use the same tactics. I think that what OCI is doing in putting people overseas is what DEA did many years ago to fight this international problem, and that is station some agents overseas and work more closely in the countries where it's happening. But they do have parallels, that's certain.
And we've seen there's some ties to terrorist groups. The link is weak, but it's there, and we have ties in a lot of our cases to organized crime, not just here in the United States, but worldwide. One of the things that FDA now regulates, and this is a medicines convention, but we regulate tobacco, and counterfeit tobacco products, counterfeit cigarettes are very heavily in organized crime control, overseas organized control, whether they're Asian groups or Eastern European organized crime groups. And with the drugs, we do see that. We do see a fund. It's a very, the problem, and I'm sure all of us in this room agree, it's very low risk. It's high profit, it's low risk. And the fact of the matter is, and we talked about Avastin, ounce for ounce, Avastin is 3 times more expensive than an ounce of gold. And it just makes it very, very lucrative. But we have not really seen it other than the example with the Lipitor with the drug cartel.
The only thing I'd add is that the Department of Treasury has a financial center, FinCEN, and FinCEN had in the past reported on Mexican drug trafficking organizations investing in pharmacias. That was at a time when it was prior to Part D Medicare, and there were a lot of U.S. citizens going across the border into Mexico to buy medicines. Now, whether those acquisitions were for the purpose of distributing counterfeit medicines or for laundering the profits from the illegal drug trade, I don't know. I don't think they reached a conclusion on that, but that was one element. The other element we saw and have seen is Russian organized crime groups in the New York area with connections back into the Russian Federation being involved in diversion activity, some theft activity, major theft activity by well-organized Colombian or Cuban groups coming out of Florida, operating on the northeast and east coast of the U.S. So some of the groups are well organized, not necessarily former drug trafficking organization members, but certainly some indication that that's the case. And we had a question over here from the panel.
My name is Shekhar from this company called UPI Tag. So the thing is that you cannot stop Canadian drugs coming into the US with your trade sanctions, putting cases and all. The main proof of that is US Secret Service could not do anything to a Canadian printing fake currency from the last 4 years. Please go on to my Facebook page and see those details. You cannot do anything in Canada legally from the US. Okay. Please go and see at the details. Only way to do is you improve your technology, you bring in your US technology, track and trace and these new coming laws quicker into the market. There is practically we are not selling our technology, we are not trying to do that. Still we practically know laws, they have this problem and we cannot do anything there. Only way is to track and trace the whole products flowing from there to here and from here to there.
Thank you. Jim, Phil?
Phil could
comment.
Anything that tightens up the supply chain is good, like track and trace. A lot of these laws are good, and as it was mentioned before, you know, United States has a very good regulatory supply chain controls. So anything that tightens it up makes it better. But there are other issues. It doesn't really do much for foreign unapproved drugs that are coming in. It doesn't do much for this direct to consumer through the internet. We could argue, we could discuss whether this will be a problem that will ever be solved and ever be stamped out. And the answer is probably no, as long as we're in a global environment. And as long as there are, free markets, and we'll probably always be seeing harmful products, whatever they may be, whether they're medical products or counterfeit ball bearings or airbags or whatever the case may be. But it is a global effort because Canada might not be, it's illegal to sell drugs in Canada to Canadians that are not approved in Canada. So they're coming over to the United States or they're going to other countries, but that can very well change for Canada. It is a global problem, and it requires many different facets of solutions. There's just not one panacea.
Other questions from the floor? Okay, I'll have to ask some questions.
Back to you.
Now we're going to move to the hard ones. Another round of hard questions. Gillian, you were talking a little bit about improvements to the regulatory structures. We've talked a lot about enforcement here on the policing, customs side of the house. Perhaps there are some other elements that were suggested in the report, the IOM report, that you could comment on.
Investing in regulatory systems abroad. We didn't specifically. I think it was hard because we were talking about all low and middle income countries, and the improvements that are going to be needed somewhere in Latin America would be very different from that, which would be suitable for somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. The committee did talk a lot about medicines distribution and medicines retail in low and middle income countries. It's chaotic, and that makes it very difficult for the regulators to inspect the market if the market is, someone selling medicines on the side of the street. And in a lot of poor countries, people, just dry goods sellers sell medicines. There aren't enough people trained in community pharmacy. And, the regulators, the regulatory agencies don't have enough staff. They don't have enough manpower. So when they do get out to inspect retail sites, and they find egregious violations, but they're still reluctant to shut an unqualified distributor down, a pharmacist, not a pharmacist, a medicine seller down, because then they're removing from a rural or remote community the only place to buy medicines. So they talked a lot about different tools that regulators can use to improve medicines retail, especially in rural and remote areas. They talked about accreditation, franchising, and things that the government can do. The government, even in a rich country, can't necessarily be responsible for it's too big of a task to improve all medicines retail in rural and remote areas. They said one thing the government can do is create an environment where the private sector can thrive. For example, you maybe give low interest or no interest loans for business improvement. You can take a place where they're selling medicines where it's just not a suitable, no air condition, no fan, no bars on the windows, no security against theft. Give the business owner a low interest loan to improve that. And then, work with the business owners, maybe do some training. One thing that our committee member had started in Tanzania was this accredited drug dispensing outlet program where people who were selling medicines were given training, training that would qualify, let's say, a pharmacy assistant, a pharmacy tech, and then in return for taking that training and for complying with all the government regulations about, cold chain, with the regulations on good distribution, they're rewarded. They're legally authorized to sell some restricted substances, the kinds of things that they might, start making a better profit off of. And then the government promotes that. They use social marketing. They promote the accredited drug dispensing outlets, and then people start to go to them. And it just makes better use of the very few community pharmacists in a country. Then these people are put in a position, if the pharmacy techs, if they train people with, let's say, a 10th grade education to be a pharmacy tech, a pharmacy assistant, then the people with bachelors in pharmacy in the country can take on more responsibilities, let's say buying for a whole group of accredited drug dispensing outlets. Just making more efficient use of the available staff in a country. They also talked a lot about franchising, there's a medicines franchise in West Africa called Care Shop, which it's the same kind of idea. It takes, for example, the wholesale buying, negotiating the wholesale market in any country is just very tricky. There's a lot of shady stuff going on in drugs wholesale. And if this person isn't trained in pharmacy, they're not really qualified to be negotiating the wholesale market. And also the drug sellers wind up spending a lot of money traveling back and forth to the capital, maybe a couple $100 a month, buying medicines wholesale, and they're not buying enough to really command any kind of bargaining power, and they're not qualified to be judging the wholesale distributors. So when they're part of a franchise, the franchisor comes around, the franchisor takes their orders. One person is commanding a much larger buying power for the whole franchise. And then the business owner likes it too, because that means it's that much time spent away, less time spent away from the business, it's that much less time spent traveling back and forth, and they're getting a better price from the wholesale distributors. So they talked about those kinds of changes that are manageable for governments to do, for governments in low and middle income countries that have the potential to improve the market, to give patients in poor countries an option, a safe option where they can buy medicines.
Great, appreciate that. Let's move to any closing comments or observations that the panel might have. Phil, comment or observations?
No, I was listening to some of your statistics of what is going on. It's interesting, how things have developed in the counterfeit drug world. We have one of the things that we've done also in OCI, and we're just trying to get this off the ground, is trying to do a strategic analysis and a risk-based assessment on trying to put these pieces together. As it was mentioned in one of the earlier presentations, we're law enforcement, and I'm sure the FBI was a lot like this. you know, you become very reactionary. You're not, you don't have the time, you don't have the time and the resources to become proactive and putting these pieces together. And we are trying to do that, especially with this foreign unapproved. We look at a lot of foreign unapproved medicines, and any gap in the supply chain is basically an open window for counterfeits. You know, and I laugh when I say that, because I live up in Middle Maryland, just about 45 miles north of here, and we have these darn stink bugs that come in, and they're horrible, and they're these cumbersome beetles, and they fly around, they get in the house, and then they hit you in the head like a baseball bat. And so I got young kids. I got an 8-year-old son and a 13-year-old daughter. She's going on 24 years old, but she's a good kid. But they leave the doors open all the time, and these darn stink bugs come in. And I came home from work the other night, and I was particularly annoyed about a particular problem one of our agents was having in one of our cases. And of course, one of these stink bugs smacks me in my forehead, and I'm saying to my wife, I said, "What is it? These kids can't close the darn door when they come in." I go, "I got this problem of counterfeit medicines coming in the United States, and this problem with this." I'm not going to say it. Somebody, Department of Justice, no, not Linda, no, somebody, no, out west. And so it's interesting to see, you know, how a lot of this has developed over the years, and how some of these, to us, I mentioned a lot of these countries that don't have much of a regulatory structure, and they don't have much of a criminal investigative structure. We still have police in the United States who, in some of the best police departments in the world, here in the United States, will pull over, you know, a vehicle that would be full of medicines and just tag it as stolen property. And they just don't, you know, it's not quite there yet. So.
Great, thank you. Other panelists, closing comments, observations?
Well, I'd maybe reiterate what Phil is saying. Awareness and training, you can't do enough of it. It's part of the problem. I look to things in Europe. OCI did a case on a Turkish company named Oze, and Oze had set up a distributorship in Germany, I believe. And one of the things they tried to play on was to give this plausible deniability to buyers in Europe, that they could import from outside the EU into Germany, and then the parallel distribution that is allowed in Europe would make that transaction legal. Well, that's just not the case, and there's not a good understanding in this country or in Europe of what happens. The parallel distribution is from a legal product in one EU country to another EU country, and that's it. You can't bring in something like Oze was doing. So, you know, we need to do more with law enforcement. Many law enforcement agencies don't understand the regulatory aspects of a complex field like counterfeit drugs, and then the transnational aspects of it. So more and more needs to be done, and this conference helps do that.
Thanks, Jim. Ladies?
Yeah, I just like to say that at the WCO we also strongly believe in cooperation, so we really want to cooperate with other law enforcement agencies and maybe take our operations one step further and hopefully bring in some concrete arrests. And just on another note, I mentioned our IPM tool, so WCO also tries to develop some useful tools for the field customs officers, and we've been working with some of the track and trace and authentication companies that were interfacing with our IPM database. So this is going to allow customs officers to use mobile devices and scan authentication solutions or track and trace solutions on products and immediately get a response about if the product is genuine or if there's any suspicion. So.
Great, thank you.
I guess I would just agree that I think this kind of event is really helpful in building momentum for international action against these crimes, and just further discussion of different ways we can promote the safety of medicines.
Great, thank you. Well, I'd ask the audience to join me in a round of applause for the panel. all done, and I think we all earned a 15-minute break. We'll resume our discussions at 10:40. Thank you.